Greetings, panelists and participants. This is Victor Mansa, a management associate from Africa Health Business. I welcome you all to the third webinar of the Africa Health Business webinar series for 2022, themed Reform, Expanding Africa's Production of Vaccines, Therapeutics and Diagnostics. To start off, I would like to highlight some guidelines for the session. Attendees will be on mute during the session. We request all to observe the allocated time during the session. The webinar will be live streamed on the Africa Health Business YouTube channel. The session is in English and will last for 90 minutes. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A session and they will be responded to as much as possible. There will be pop-up polls as the webinar progresses. Participants are encouraged to tweet during the session under hashtag AHB 2022. On the program, we will have 5 panelists, a moderator from Africa Health Business, 4 speakers from Africa Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, Aspen for Pharmacare, and Kenya Biovax Institute and Revital Healthcare. Thereafter, we'll have a Q&A session, potentials from the panelists, and finally closing the webinar. And now, let me introduce the moderator for the day. Dr. Inchal is a healthcare professional with over 6 years of experience in the Kenyan public healthcare. She has provided leadership in redefining pharmaceutical care innovative solutions. Prior to joining Africa Health Business, she worked for Kilifi County government, where she headed the pharmacy department, and she was also the founder of the Medication Therapy Management Clinic. Previously, she worked as a consultant with STEMA in United Kingdom and United Healthcare Futures in Switzerland, where she focused on pioneering new approaches to community health and sustainable development in communities across Kenya. Dr. Inchal is currently serving as a project manager at Africa Health Business. Welcome, Dr. Inchal.
Thank you, Victor, for that nice introduction. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever in the world you're joining us from. My name is, as Victor mentioned, my name is Dr. Hinjal Patian. I'm the project manager at Africa Health Business, and I will be your moderator for this session. So thank you for taking the time to join in us today as we talk about expanding Africa's production of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So as we all know, it has been more than 2 years since the dreaded C word hit our world. And since then, some countries have managed to vaccinate majority of their populations and are well on their way to vaccinate for the widespread coverage of the boosters now. But back in February of this year, most of the world's countries, including most African countries, did not have near enough vaccines to cover all health workers or risk groups, never mind the rest of the population. So as you can see on your screens, we have about 0 to 19% who have not even received one of the COVID-19 vaccine dose. And that shows that, we have a lot of work to do, to make sure that, we are well ahead. And, it showed us how vulnerable we are, and we are the ones who can fill this long-term gap that we have going. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as you can see here on this slide, it's interesting to know that in China, there are about 5,000 drug manufacturers that serve about 1.4 billion people. In India, we have about 10,000 drug manufacturers that serve 1.4 billion people. For that same amount of people in Africa, which is 1.1 billion people, we only have about 375 drug manufacturers. That ratio is not ideal, and we must and we should do something about it. Ultimately, the lesson that we've learned from this pandemic is that health is not a luxury. It's a fundamental human right and the foundation of social, economic, and political stability. So thank you once again, and I look forward to a very productive and interesting discussion from all our speakers and panelists. On that note, yes, yeah. So as I said, what's remaining for us to become self-reliant and to make bolder and more deliberate actions as we move forward. So on that cue, let me quickly introduce all our panel speakers joining us today. So we have Mr. Patrick Tipu, who is the head of science and innovation at BioVac in South Africa. He also serves as the vice president of the developing country vaccine manufacturing networks and is also on the board of the recently formed Emerging Biopharmaceuticals Manufacturing Network. So thank you, Mr. Patrick. And then we have Ms. Lorraine joining us, who is the Group Chief Operations Officer of Aspen Pharmacare in South Africa. Then we have Dr. Michael Luciola, who is the CEO of Kenya Biovax Institute based in Kenya. He's highly experienced and a senior healthcare executive. And then we have Ms. Kripali Sham. She's the technical director of Revital, which is based in Kilifi. So thank you for the time, for giving us your time and being here today. We'll just move on right to Mr. Patrick Tapoor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hinjal. Just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay. And is someone going to load the slides, or should I do it from my side?
No, someone will move the slides for you.
Okay, excellent. So as part of this panel discussion, I'm going to focus on vaccine manufacturing in Africa. There is a lot to say, and so I needed to be very selective in what I was going to focus on in the 10 minutes allotted to me. So there are three areas that I'd like to cover, share some thoughts around the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, then talk a little bit about the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, and then finally end up with reflecting on possibly two key factors out of a whole basket of key factors that are essential to establish sustainable vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Next slide. So the AVMI, the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, was established about 10 years ago. As I said to Hinjal earlier, that this was way before vaccines became the topic around the dinner table and the flavor of the month. And we foresaw then as a group that there will come a time where we'll be in the situation that COVID-19 confronted us with. And so we set ourselves up with this mission of advancing the establishment of sustainable human vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa. Next slide. And we've been very busy working with partners over the last 10 years or more, but particularly given the constraints of time, I want to focus on this report, which came out of a study which we did in partnership with the WHO and UNIDO, which we call the VMPA study, the Vaccine Manufacturing and Procurement in Africa study. If you want to access that document, you can go onto our website, and I'll post that later on the last slide. But one of the things I'd like to pull out is this key issue of the need for a long-term vision tied to national and health security, as well as regional health security. And up until very recently, that was sadly lacking. One of the silver linings on this COVID cloud is that that has changed. Next slide, please. And this is where the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing comes into full focus. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Framework for Action and the 8 programs involved in the Framework for Action. Next slide. So confronted with the COVID-19 situation and the challenges with respect to vaccine access, which obviously impacted on health security in Africa, the AU charged the African CDC to establish what has become known as the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, the PAVM. Now, it's important to appreciate that the current state of affairs, at least this was 2 2 years, 1 or 2 years ago, was that less than 1% of the vaccines utilized on the continent was made in the continent. And so with this in mind, the PAVM then gathered all the critical key stakeholders across the continent, political, technical, financial, and otherwise, and set itself this target that by 2040, we in Africa should be making 60% of the vaccines that we use. Now, some people might say this is an ambitious target, and it is an ambitious target, but it's important that we set ourselves the stretch target because things have to change. Next slide, please. So besides setting this target, it also crafted a vision around African vaccine manufacturing. And again, it's tied into this notion of health security, and one could extend that and say even national security. But there are two components to this, all tied to sustainability, one focusing on development and the other on manufacturing. And I think my personal opinion is that these are two critical items that need to be linked. We shouldn't only focus on manufacturing, we should focus on development as well. So the PAVM, through lots of stakeholder engagement exercises and consultations and work groups, developed what is called a framework for action, which includes 8 bold programs. And these bold programs have been identified in terms of targeting the key areas where the ecosystem needs to be enabled. And I'll just walk through them very briefly. First, starting on the top left, is the market design and demand intelligence area, which I'll talk to a little bit more, and the importance of this program. Then I think all of us are aware of the need for regulatory strengthening, as all of the products that we make go into people, and these are medicines, and so therefore the quality, safety, and efficacy need to be absolutely ensured. Then the next one is encapsulates 2 programs. There's a focus on R&D and then talent development, and I'll talk a little bit more about R&D as well. But workforce development is also linked to roll this big boulder up a steep mountain slope. The next one is infrastructure development, and this talks to factories and facilities and laboratories, production facilities, quality control facilities, but also to the policy environment in terms of enabling trade and regulatory in and out of countries and across borders. Next is, again, there's 2 joined at the hip, technology transfer and intellectual property. And there's been many debates in the media and in other fora around access to IP and the possibility of invoking waivers for certain IP, pieces of IP associated with vaccine technologies. But access to technology, I believe, is the most accelerated way through technology transfer of building this capacity and getting into commercial production. And then last but not least is the need for finance. And the capital investments required are enormous. And it takes a long time for these facilities to be built, and from starting to get into production, product out the door, it takes a lot of working capital as well. So access to finance and the proper type of finance to incentivize investments in capacity building are all critically important. Obviously, we can talk for days on end about each of these bold programs, but this is just to give you a view of the work that has taken place over the last year or 2. Next slide, please. So moving on then, I'm just going to dip into, and I've pulled out two key factors, next slide, that we're going to focus on. The one, as I said earlier on, was is the market demand. And one needs to appreciate that in order to have a sustainable industry, a sustainable business, you need to sell your product. You need to sell your product at a profit, and so that those revenues can be reinvested in the capacity building to expand that even further. And this requires commitment in the form of policy, integrated policies, but commitment to support local manufacture. And I cannot emphasize that enough, that without the support of local manufacture, both from African governments who self-procure vaccines, the challenge for us in Africa is that 40 of the African countries rely on vaccine donations through UNICEF, supported by Gavi, completely or partially, and that distorts the market and the way the market operates in Africa. Many people say that if you want to access the market in Africa, you have to go to Copenhagen. And so very positively, Gavi has come to the table now, recognizing that it has a role to play with respect to reshaping the market in Africa, has issued this white paper outlining their thinking and strategy and intent with respect to examining or re-examining their model and recrafting their model to incentivize vaccine production. And I'd be happy to discuss that later on in depth during the Q&A. Next slide, please. So the vaccine market is critically important. Next slide, please. The second issue that I want to focus on is the importance of vaccine R&D. And the one thing about R&D is that not only is it focused on developing products, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but also with respect to this important issue of technology transfers, the R&D capability within an organization brings in the scientific know-how, which then enhances the absorptive capacity of the company to receive technologies from a partner. So that's the one thing that R&D or vaccine product development capability delivers. The second is, if you don't have vaccine R&D capability, you are going to be eternally reliant on technology transfer partners to deliver access to manufacturing. And these black arrows along this vaccine value chain indicate the traditional junction points at which technology transfers normally flow in. But if we are to break the cycle of dependence in a bigger way, then we have to develop product ourselves that gives us the freedom to set the selling price, to determine the volumes which we're going to make, and to determine the markets that we're going to supply. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. I just want to highlight this as an exemplar of what can be done with respect to product development. And I have a bias coming from BioVac. I'm not going to go through the detail of the slide, but just to say that BioVac has demonstrated, I would argue, that it is possible to build vaccine R&D capability. We've done so through a series of partnerships, working on many different vaccine development projects. Two things I'd like to point out in particular on the slide is in the first column, the Hib conjugate vaccine, the technology which we developed, we have out-licensed that through a technology transfer to 3 companies, 2 in Asia and 1 in the US, and they've gone on to commercialize the vaccine. So this is a real shot in the arm for us, that we can also talk about technology transfers out of Africa. And then in the last column with the GBS conjugate vaccine, we were afforded a grant by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to work on the development of a novel Group B Streptococcus vaccine. There is no GBS vaccine currently available. And we have developed that to a proof of concept, and we need to raise the funding to take that into the first in human trials. So that's just an example of what can be done. Next, please. I think the next slide, when it comes up, will focus on the mRNA Technology Hub. I think many of us have heard of the mRNA Technology Hub as a mission of the MPP, the Medicines Patent Pool, and the WHO. And I think it's a shot in the arm for Africa that a consortium based in Africa was chosen to be the home of the hub. And the players are listed there, and BioVac is part of that, and Afrigen is part of that, African CDC, the African Union, the Medicines Patent Pool, and the South African Medical Research Council. So the needle is shifting in the right direction. Next. Next slide, please. And so in ending my talk, I want to provoke the thinking a little bit further and extend our thinking a little bit further, that our vision should extend beyond simply vaccines supply security in Africa. But we should think of an industry, a thriving industry, established in Africa in a sustainable way, as a contributor and a player in the global vaccine supply chain, especially in emergency disease outbreak situations. Next slide, please. And so with that, Angel, I'll hand back to you. There's the website of AVMI, where you can get more information on, and I'd be happy to take questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick. I really liked all what you said, especially the point about how the needle is pointing in the right directions. I'm sure we'll have more questions in the question and answer session later on. So thank you so much. I would like to welcome now, okay, sorry, we have a poll question, which the participants can just answer. The host and the panelists cannot vote, so we'll just observe, and then we will reveal the answers at the end of the session. Okay, great. So moving on to our next speaker of the day, we have Ms. Lorraine Hill, the Group CEO from Aspen Pharmacare. She's responsible for multiple operational areas of business, including strategic manufacturing, development, pharmaceutical affairs, and IT. So over to you, Ms. Lorraine. The floor is yours.
Can you see me? I think it's coming through now, the feed.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through a brief introduction here, and I think a lot of this has already been said, but I think it underscores so many of the activities that we're going to talk about today that it's probably worth reiterating. And that is really that people require access to medicinal products and healthcare technologies to achieve the highest attainable standard of health. So, and that right to health is being supported by international law. So it's a right, it's not something that's optional. And despite some progress over, I've been in the industry many years, I won't say how many, that progress hasn't managed to overcome the inequality that still exists today. And if I look at the LMIC countries or low middle income countries, including Africa, they've been the most impacted by the medicines inequality. Then we had the, I think you called it the dreaded C word, the COVID pandemic. And this further highlighted the inequality, with the developed world really being at the forefront of the vaccination development programs and manufacturing, and the LMIC countries being left to last. But one of the real positives to come out of this is that the pandemic spearheaded a renewed effort to ensure medicine access and equality. So I think Patrick's taken us through some of the initiatives that he's involved in, and there are a number of such initiatives. So at least it's galvanized action. Africa is looking to localize R&D, and I think Patrick took you through quite a bit on the value of R&D and manufacturing to assure African supply sustainably. And I think key also is that there's a number of different efforts, and we've seen some of the initiatives, but it will be really important to integrate all of those efforts within the healthcare sector to ensure a robust end-to-end supply chain. So we need to make sure that we don't have a lot of one thing and nothing of something else. There needs to be a high level of coordination. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Aspen, and one of our strategic objectives is our commitment to enhancing access to medicines, providing reliable supply of quality products, improving the health and quality of life of patients, and enhancing access across the geographies of our operations. And I'm sure you're all aware that Aspen has key operations within Africa. We also have a history of responding to critical healthcare situations in Africa. We supply a number of essential medicines to the public sector in South Africa, the majority manufactured locally. We pioneered HIV supply in Africa through voluntary licenses and local manufacture back in 2003, 2004. We had some partnerships with Eli Lilly on MDR TB that allowed supply of 2 products. Then during COVID, the beginning of COVID, dexamethasone and anesthetic supply, we were at the forefront of, and then came the manufacture of the J&J COVID vaccine, followed by the license rights to Aspenovax. So we've demonstrated in the past that we are willing and able to undertake various activities to ensure the availability of these products on the continent and manufactured within South Africa through investments we've made in South Africa. And to a point also that Patrick raised, it's very critical to have the technical skills and capability across the various dosage forms that are going to be needed. It's all well and good to have buildings or technology transfers, but we've got to have recipients on the continent. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the COVID vaccine success story. Once COVID hit and we started to become aware of the lack of capacity or lack of vaccine availability, we sought opportunities to leverage our sterile manufacturing capability. And we partnered with J&J to contract manufacture that COVID vaccine for supply in Africa. We did have focus and dedicated skilled project teams from both companies, so the emphasis on both. The technology transfer needs to be given as much as it's received. Collaborative and innovative procurement strategies to overcome global supply constraints. I'm sure everyone's aware, right from filter bags to tubing to glass vials to stoppers, everything was short. So there were a number of measures that we put in place to make sure that we weren't constrained by those shortages. We micromanaged all the constrained activities. So those who on the call are aware of technical transfers will know that regularly there are bottlenecks, and we had a very active program to manage those. And we managed to complete the technical transfer within 6 months, which from an industry perspective is really groundbreaking. What was also sought and given was support from regulators, government departments, health authorities. You have with a number of countries, their permits and other documentation required to be able to move the drug substance and products through the borders. We scaled up aggressively to a 24/7 production, and we had these achievements endorsed globally. We had to overcome several challenges. The drug substance supply, there was the issue with the emergent drug substance supply, which was in the public domain, as well as global shortages, which emerged through the manufacturing transfer. We also challenged industry paradigms and set new benchmarks, which I think is very important going forward, because we can't let ourselves fall back into it taking years to do tech transfers and getting these products registered. The need is now. The need is not in 5 years' time. And I think overall from this experience, the African patients benefited. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about partnering in Africa. So to Patrick's one point, he's had the R&D and the tech transfer. So over the years, Aspen's developed a number of strategic relationships, allowing access to opportunities to serve African patients. For the ARVs back in the early 2000s, we had a number of voluntary licenses for a range of antiretrovirals from the likes of BMS, GSK, MSD, Tibitec, Gilead. So we made sure we had a range of treatments available. We did a license and tech transfer for cycloserine and capreomycin for MDR-TB. We acquired the post-patent intellectual property for the anesthetics and dexamethasone that was used in COVID. We had the manufacturing partnership with J&J for the COVID vaccine, which then followed with a license agreement with J&J for a Spinavax. And recently we announced the license agreement with the Serum Institute for a range of vaccines we will tech transfer and supply into Africa. We've also engaged the support of CEPI and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the Serum Initiative. And we have a number of ongoing activities to drive access to vaccines and therapeutics to support access in Africa and other low middle income countries. We also had a collaboration with Siemens and the German government, who have given us some manufacturing technology support. Next slide, please. We also, I think, need to address some continental support initiatives. So to Patrick's point, there's a lot of initiatives that are out there that we need to gather support. The standardization of requirements across the continent would help a lot. That includes marketing authorization and registration requirements, drug product release of vaccines by regulators, permit harmonization. Fully understand every country needs autonomy on all these matters, but the more standardized the requirements and the data required are, the easier it will be to facilitate having these finalized. And then logistics and storage initiatives to make sure that once the vaccines are made and distributed, that they actually get to the patient having been transported and stored. The AMA I think is a brilliant initiative, but we do need to make sure we accelerate that in this area to make sure we can enhance the regulatory process. There are a number of experts within the World Health Organization, and I think we need to collaborate as much as possible with them. To Patrick's point, this is very capital intensive, so funding support for the sustainable framework, and then procurement initiatives to support the ramp up and sustainability of continental capacity and capability. So in the early days and the ramp up period, there's going to need to be funding support to make sure that the volumes and the pricing can remain competitive and allow the continent to garner its own supply. And then training and skills support, which there are a few initiatives underway currently. but we're going to have to make sure that that is continuous as the scale-up happens. Next slide, please. So in terms of the commitment to the future, Aspen is committed to African vaccine manufacture. I think we've published recently and in our annual results, we shared and I think you shared in the program as well, that the African Union has called for at least 30% of all vaccines needed by the continent to be manufactured on the continent. And as you pointed out earlier, Hinjal, the frequency at the moment is 99% imported, 1% on the continent. And then supply of these vaccines is critical for future African manufacturing footprint, providing predictable and sustainable volumes. So we do need to know which vaccines and what the volumes will be in order to design and right size the requirements. Confidence to invest as more certainty on volumes and recovery of overheads. So as this initiative gets momentum and we are certain that the production will move to the continent, I think there'll be more confidence, certainly on Aspen's side, but I'm sure globally to invest. And we have planned some further expansion. We are investing a further 2 billion rand to expand our manufacturing base. And we're adding 2 additional lines and related infrastructure. And that build started this year and will complete in 2024. So I think we've demonstrated globally competitive capability and competence in the geography. So it's something that can be used as a pilot or to benchmark that it is possible. And it will become a strategic advantage for the continent. So I think that's it from my side. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lorraine. I like how you said about, it's a fundamental human right. And, I'm happy to hear about all the quick responses by Aspen to the healthcare situations in Africa. The need is now and not 5 years from now. That's a very strong point. So thank you for that. Let's move on to the third speaker of the day, Dr. Michael Luciola. Oh, sorry about that. We have a poll question which the participants can access and just choose your answer, and we'll reveal the response at the end of the session. So here's Dr. Michael Luciola, CEO of Kenya Biovax. He's been a member and Institute of Clinical Research in the UK, the Royal Society of Medicine, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in the UK, and the International Society of Vaccines. Very interesting. Over to you, Dr. Michael. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hinjal, and it's a pleasure joining the panel discussion today to talk about supply chain solutions and to just brainstorm around some thoughts, some comments, and some proposals around how or what the challenges are when it comes to production of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but also think through some solutions on how we can get from the product from manufacture to commercialization to the patients. So in the next slide, just to start off is to a basic standard statement that the thoughts and the comments are basically my own based on my knowledge and experience within this area. So in the next slide. So basically, what are supply chains and what do we mean by supply chains? So essentially, it's just the flow of goods and services between businesses and locations from the point of origin to the point of consumption. So this is just to give an understanding of the breadth, the end-to-end activities when it comes to supply chains. And essentially, it's when you look at vaccines manufacturing, when you look at vaccines commercialization, it's about the inputs, the raw materials that we use that are required to make the vaccines, to make the diagnostics, to make the therapeutics. And then, of course, it's about the inventory that we as manufacturers will be holding. And then eventually, it's about the vaccine getting to the patient, the finished goods. So this is a conversation that really embeds the supply chain solution that we've been thinking about as manufacturers. In the next slide. So what I wanted to touch on is really the two out of the three important points: the inputs and then the finished goods. Because in between, when it comes to inventory, I think that's fairly standard. So when it comes to supply chains and what the proposals on how to make it smart is concerned, when it comes to the raw materials or the inputs, it's really about three things. One, how do we ensure that the process costs are kept as low as possible? We know that how expensive it is to take a pharmaceutical ingredient from a bench to the patient. Typically, you look at between 5 to 7 billion US dollars for just one drug product. Very expensive. And then when you talk about vaccines, it's even more expensive because of the technology that's required. So how can we be smart in terms of reducing the costs of the inputs, reducing the costs of the raw materials that we require for the manufacture of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics? And then secondly, when it comes to smart inputs, smart thinking around raw materials, is how do we optimize these very scarce resources? How do we ensure that the process of production is optimized so that there's almost nil loss in the process? Because first of all, it's very difficult to get the raw materials at this point in time. So we have to be very prudent in how we are managing the resources in the production process. And then thirdly, of course, is how to maximize on the yields. When it comes to vaccines manufacturing, we know how delicate the whole process can be. You can very easily lose a whole batch of an important vaccine through the production process. But then equally, you can actually ensure that you're maximizing the outputs by using the smartest process possible to get the best yields possible. So this is the early stage, the beginning part of the supply chain. Where do we source our raw materials, and how can we optimize? How can we make best use of these raw materials from the word go? And these are just examples of the raw materials that we the vaccines manufacturing area we look at. If you look at the active pharmaceutical ingredients, when you look at the excipients, the current supply chain is quite stretched, it's quite challenged when it comes to sourcing pharmaceutical ingredients. When it comes to sourcing the excipients, we at BioVax at the moment, we are engaged in collaborating with the sources of these vaccine ingredients and excipients. And already there is a challenge in the marketplace because everybody else is also going for the same inputs, for the same raw materials. So how can we be smart in sourcing these inputs? And then secondly, of course, it's the packaging material, the glass vials, the syringes. These are really key inputs into the vaccines manufacturing process. And then thirdly, of course, it's the machinery and the equipment. So you can see all these three important inputs into the manufacturing for vaccines play a really important role. We have to be very smart in how we are sourcing and how we are managing these inputs. Later on, I have some ideas on how to work smart in managing these raw materials. Then in the next slide, this is the second part of the supply chain. So remember, the first part was the inputs. Now the second part is the finished goods, the vaccines as they roll out of the manufacturing facilities. How do we work smart in ensuring that the supply chain is optimized with the finished goods? So one is it's about producing in large volumes. Vaccines manufacturing can be quite expensive, but then when you have the large volumes, you start realizing the return on the investment. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, it's about yields. Are we adopting the best, most well-researched methods to do the formulation, to do the fill and finish, to do the propagation, the isolation, the purification, all those steps to make the finished product? Are we optimizing on that the yield from a particular seed, for example? And then, of course, it's about delivery times. It's about development times. We know at the moment, just to get a product from bench to clinic is about 5 years, 5 to 7 years. But things are changing now. Technologies, newer technologies are being applied. We now, within the vaccines manufacturing area, we have new technologies, new platforms. The mRNA platform is just one of the examples where we can shorten the delivery times. We can shorten the development times from bench to clinic. So this is another way to work smart through the supply chain to shorten the times required. And then, as my colleagues had mentioned earlier, it's about quality. Are we producing the best quality product that's safe, that is effective? So when we incorporate the quality measures in the manufacturing process towards the end, for example, the GMP certification, validation, qualification, right from the early stages of the process all the way to validation, are we making sure that the finished product has the WHO qualification, for example, because this is an important part that feeds into the end stage of the supply chain. So quality is really key in that regard. And then, of course, the formulations, the packaging, and the methods of delivering the product from the manufacturer to the clinic, the manufacturer to the patient. We have to be smart. And how can we be smart with the formulations that we're having? How can we be smart with the packaging that we do for the vaccines? And of course, the vehicles that we're using to deliver. How can we be smart in that regard? And of course, the tracking, the anti-theft measures, and the anti-counterfeiting methods are equally important when it comes to being smart with the supply chain. This is really critical, especially when we're looking at the safety of the patients to whom the vaccines, the therapeutics are being administered. We're aware that some of the counterfeited products may not have the right active ingredient, and that can be quite detrimental to the health of the population. So these are just important pieces of how to work smart with the finished product at the end of the day. So with some suggestions about improving or smartening up the supply chain, I think 3 things really stand out. And this is about procurement, it's about the standards, and it's about information sharing. So under procurement, it's about pooling resources together. The experience we are starting to have within the continent, for example, with the conversations at the Africa CDC, Patrick mentioned about the African Vaccines Manufacturing Initiative. There's a lot of conversation around how do we pool the procurement process so that we can benefit from quite a number of things, including cost reductions. How can we pool when it comes to procurement of inputs, and how can we pool together so that we can be able to work smart in shaping the market for the finished products? So pool procurement, and it's been demonstrated by, for example, the Gavi are doing a fantastic job when it comes to pooling for finished products. Within Africa, we have the Africa Vaccines Acquisition Trust, the AVAT, that is advancing the conversation around pooled procurement, setting up pooled advanced procurement agreements with governments, just so that we can benefit from this working smart within the supply chain. And I must also mention that when it comes to machinery, equipment, this is an area that maybe hasn't had much conversation in Africa. So we are aware that quite a number of countries are involved or are getting involved in the vaccines manufacturing process. But one thought that maybe hasn't been entertained is how can we, as African vaccines manufacturers, pool our resources together to source machinery, pool our resources together to source equipment, because you probably realize almost every country in Africa is interested now in manufacturing one or more vaccines. It's usually the same equipment that we'd use. It's the same type of filling lines that we'd use, labeling equipment, isolators, mechanical elements within the vaccines premises. How can we pool these resources together so that we can benefit from the numbers game? So that's around pooling, working smart within the supply chain. The second bit is around standards, and it's been mentioned again earlier about the regulatory authority that's being set up in Africa, the Africa Medicines Agency. And of course, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. These are central authorities or bodies that can enable to plan, that can enable to predict and also assist in execution of, for example, pandemic preparedness. So this is also critical when it comes to thinking how can we work smart within the supply chain. It's important that we standardize so that we are able to work across borders along the same quality lines. And then finally, it's just about information sharing. We know how important it is to connect information systems. And this can really allow us to optimize on things like the pooling strategies, on things like volume aggregation, stock allocation, market shaping, and all these factors come together to ensure that we have the best population coverage when it comes to making available these important medicines. And of course, we have the African Medical Supplies Platform, which is a really important example of the effort that is being made in Africa to optimize the way information is shared amongst countries. And this has really made an impact when it comes to logistics, when it comes to delivery of vaccines. So I just wanted to share with you all about these important points around how can we be smart, how can we optimize within the supply chain from inputs all the way to the finished products. And I think that is the end. I'll be happy to take any questions and relay the experience that we have here at Kenya Biobanks. Thank you, Hinja. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. That was really interesting. I mean, even for me, it was something new that I learned, and I like how you kept emphasizing on each of the processes. It did really make me think, and especially about how everyone keeps reiterating about how new technology is being applied, and how we can shorten that chain from bench to clinic. So I'll be happy to hear the questions later on. I'm sure the third poll question has been displayed on your screen. So just feel free to answer it, and we will display the responses at the end of the sessions. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Michael. So the last but not the least speaker of the day, we have Ms. Kripali Shah joining us from Revital, whereby she is the technical director of Revital, and she's also a graduate in pharmaceutical sciences. So happy to have you here, Kripali. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hinja. Happy to be engaged in this discussion today, along with all of the other esteemed panelists. So Revital Healthcare, over the past 15 years, we've grown to become Africa's largest medical device manufacturer. And as we continue to grow, we continue to focus on Africa-specific public health issues. And one such challenge we faced was the accessibility and the need for rapid diagnostic testing. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted many of Africa's challenges in accessing healthcare, as well as the inequities that lie in healthcare. Furthermore, we know that the continent imports between 70 to 90% of its medical consumables, and this became apparent when testing was halted due to this, highlighting the urgent need for self-reliance. Next slide, please. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, Kripali, I can hear you.
I think the slides have just stopped sharing, or is it just my screen? Can we go to the next slide, please? Perfect. We know that testing is the cornerstone to any disease response, but did you know that for every one test conducted in a low-income country, more than 100 are being conducted in high-income countries, despite Africa having the highest burden of the major diseases such as malaria, HIV, hepatitis? This inequity in testing threatens the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for good health. We have less than 1 in 3 children being tested for malaria, and 16% of the population do not have access to HIV testing. This is not sustainable and highlights the importance of local production in order to have a more coordinated, reliable, and self-sufficient healthcare manufacturing and supply chain for diagnostics. Next slide, please. Revital Healthcare has become the first within the region to locally produce rapid tests for COVID-19 and malaria, with others such as HIV, hepatitis, pregnancy, tumor biomarkers, all within the range of coming soon. But Revital's partnerships with institutes such as KEMRI, which is a research institute, and FIND, which is the Foundation for New Diagnostics, not only increases our local innovation, but also increases our local economic value. Revital is well on the path to African healthcare independence, and there is an unprecedented momentum to strengthen the public health response in Africa. Now is the time for Africa to invest in the development of local manufacturing facilities. Now is the time for continental collaboration to bolster African manufacturing capacity for diagnostics. And this is key when it comes to supporting a resilient health system and saving lives. Next slide, please. Regional collaboration through, for example, implementation of free trade agreements is key to take it to scale. But not only that, improved harmonization for regulatory across Africa, development partners or access to finance, technology transfer partnerships for technology advancements within our nation, R&D development, or be it policies to support local manufacturing within our country, is all vital and essential to happen between the private and government sector for localization to be successful. We need to be able to harness the synergies that public-private partnerships bring with them and create an enabling environment to significantly improve public health and for us to have the desired impact. I will say it again and time again, localization is key, but alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much more. We need to think globally, but act locally, because as everyone has rightfully said today, the time is now and not 5 years ago. So thank you, Hinjil, for this opportunity. I'll hand it over back to you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Kripali, for that. I like how you emphasized on the partnerships with local organizations, and I'm happy to hear Revital is partnering up with KEMRI, which we all know is one of the renowned research organizations in Kenya. So yeah, that's great work. So we've come to the end of all our speakers. And we can move on to an open question and answer. If any of the participants wish to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or you can drop a message in the chat box or the question and answer scheme, and I'll reach out and you can always ask them. So do we have any questions? There is one question that came across from Mr. Seve Steve Taugia, and his question was, how much capital is needed to achieve the 60% target? How much has been mobilized so far and by whom? and how can we contribute at Jaza Rift Ventures? They are an investor in healthcare in Africa. I believe that question was targeted to Mr. Patrick.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think Lorraine gave us some indication of the order of magnitude of money required. Aspen indicated that they invest in another 2 billion rand. I know that facilities required for biological production, depending on the shape and size of it and the specifics, the kinds of money that you're looking at is between 150 and 400 million dollars for such facilities. So this is the order of magnitude. If one then kind of extrapolates from that point and say, well, if this is for one facility, how many such facilities are required on the African continent to produce the 60%, which might equate to 1.6 billion doses of vaccine? You can get to some people have said, well, maybe 10 such facilities, are required. So that's the kind of money that is required. How much of this has been mobilized? We've heard of some investments coming in terms of Senegal, Egypt, Morocco, etc. But there's still a lot that needs to be secured.
Great. Thank you for your answer, Mr. Patrick. I hope that answers your question, Mr. Xavier Steve. So, yeah, we have another question from Samantha. Samantha, do you wish to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it out? Or are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, I wasn't seeing the mute button, so I was like, how am I going to unmute? I had a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So I work a lot with national security schemes across Africa. And just having gone through a lot of their data, we know medical inflation tends to be the main driver in terms of like where costs go versus, the inflation being at over 10% annually. And then you have your procedures being at like 20% annual inflation, based on what I've seen. But, procedures being at much lower frequencies. So what do governments need to be investing in to drive this down as they roll out UHC strategies? Then my second question is, even if they do things, if we're talking about, think global, act local, how much do the politics of global big pharma interfere with the extent to which we can engage with the local implementation side of things?
Thank you, Samantha. Those are very interesting, and I'm sure we can get into a lot of discussion about that. But just for the panelists to hear, the question was, so she works with the national social security schemes, whereby medication is constantly a lead driver of medical inflation, with about 10%. So she's asking, what should governments be investing in to drive these down as they roll out the UHC strategies? That was question number one. Her second question was, how much do the politics of big global pharma interfere with the extent to which we can encourage and engage in local production of drugs? Yeah, anyone from our panel wishes to take that question? Yes, Dr. Michael, I can see you.
Thanks, Angel, and thanks, Samantha, for those really good questions. And maybe I can just address the second one, the big pharma question, based on the experience that we have so far. I think for me, for us, it's been very encouraging that big pharma have been wanting to sit down and look at additional ways in which they can get medications out to their patients. So the experience from Kenya Biovax has been very encouraging. We've had conversations with the various manufacturers in terms of planning, in terms of looking at the broader strategy within Kenya, within East Africa, and it's been very, very fruitful so far. I think the big pharma are recognized to be participants in the delivery of health to patients. And the experience has been quite encouraging so far. So no, nothing really negative to say about that. I think the challenge may have been the nature of the supply chains, and I'd like to pull out COVID as an experience that many of us had. I think although the medications were there, it's the supply chain, the route to get to the patient is what was challenging. But in terms of getting the product to the patient, I think they're equally keen to encourage the continent to get involved in vaccines manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michael, for that. Samantha, for your first question, I think I'll just give it a try. So you asked about what government should be doing to drive this inflation down as they roll out UHC strategies. So the main reason why the cost of these medications are high, because we do most of these medications, as was earlier mentioned, about 60 to 80% of them, vaccines, but also medications are imported from outside. APIs are imported in from outside. So it's one of the ways the government could help lower this inflation. So it would be to encourage local manufacturing. By that, having friendlier policies, having friendlier taxation, having friendlier levies, which would help boost the local manufacturers to come out and make these drugs, and which would of course be at an affordable cost for the population. So I hope that answers your question. So we have quite a few questions in the Q&A. I'll just read them out. So there's one from Willem Hechta. I hope I pronounced your name right. Are any manufacturers going to start IVD equipment manufacturing in Africa? Rapid tests are good, but the basics of IVD. I believe this question could be for Krupali. Do you wish to answer that?
Yeah, of course. It would be really great if we had IVD equipment manufacturers within Africa, such that we don't have to purchase the equipment from outside. One step at a time. I'm sure if we can focus on IVD manufacturing, which is already started within Africa, soon to be IVD equipment would also be manufactured in Africa, because the demand for manufacturing would then be realized for Africa. So we would see more and more partnerships coming in, more and more technology advancements coming in, which would allow Africa to then also manufacture their own IVD equipment. I hope that clarifies the question.
I hope that, thank you so much, Krupali. I hope, Willem, that has answered your question. Moving on to a question by Ruth. She asks, is it possible for the panelists to comment on public-private partnerships, such as with multinational pharmaceutical companies?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one, Angel. I think that partnerships is definitely the way to go. Without partnerships, you have to take the long route, which is risky and costly. And obviously, it takes time to get to the finishing line, which is product into market. So from a BioVac experience, and we've seen other announcements as well with Aspen partnering with the Serum Institute of India, and prior to that with J&J. This is the most accelerated way of advancing this capacity building and ensure that we do get an industry going on the African continent. BioVac has been successful in 3 technology transfer partnerships with multinational partners, 2 with Pfizer, 1 on the PCV vaccine, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, and the other more recently with the Comirnaty COVID mRNA vaccine. And then the first technology transfer partnership was with Sanofi on the hexavalent vaccine. And what these partnerships deliver is, in essence, a hand-holding exercise as one gets to know the technology and builds that capacity, which you don't have to do from scratch, and you don't have to do this by trial and error. So I think that is critically important. If I may, I'd just also like to comment on what governments can do in terms of investing to perhaps roll out UHC more broadly. I think we touched on this point several times, but I don't think it can be overstated. And that is the market, the market, the market. And if governments can commit to some sort of advanced market commitment, offtake kind of agreements, it solidifies the business case so that one can do long-term planning and therefore factor in the cost of goods over a longer term, which I think would and could make a significant difference.
I like what you said, Mr. Patrick. Thank you for that. So we'll just take 2 more questions just to keep with time. So I like this question by a medical student in Uganda called Malinga Paddy Derek. He asks, what is the role of students in developing the African vaccine agenda? With inspiring students from mainstream doctors to scientists and careers in vaccine development, I believe there's a gap even after having vaccine industries without personnel.
Yeah,
Anyone?
so
Great.
So let me venture a response here. I agree. So that's my short response, that I agree that workforce development, absolutely critical. It's a critical input. But I think where we find ourselves in is a chicken and egg situation. Normally, an industry incentivizes students to focus on certain disciplines because they have a target in mind that when they have qualified, they can connect with industry. To a very large extent, that has been absent on the African continent as a draw card. And so even those individuals who were interested in biological production or pharmaceutical production often had to leave the shores of Africa to seek employment elsewhere. Now is our opportunity to break that cycle and say we are building an industry, and very importantly, as per the point made through the question, is that students have to be attracted to study these disciplines. We have to provide internships within industry, which is something that ABMI promotes and BioVac is very supportive of, and also apprenticeships. That is not just 6 months or a year, but perhaps 3-year apprenticeships that are offered to selected students to build this workforce in an accelerated way.
Great. That's interesting. Mr. Malinga Paddy Derek, I hope that answers your question. So feel free to check the websites out for any upcoming sort of events that he mentioned. I can see, Dr. Michael, you wish to say something?
Thanks, Angel. I just wanted to reiterate and agree with what Patrick mentioned about students and the impact that these kind of opportunities can have in people's careers. So we here are equally very interested and encouraging the local research institutions and universities to connect so that we can offer those kind of opportunities to the students who are coming through medical school, pharmacy school, medical research institutes. We're already establishing those connections. It's so important because we have to work at ways to not just develop talent within our respective countries, but also retain that talent. The talent is there. It just needs to be tapped and given an opportunity to really express itself. So really good question. Thank you.
I really like your answer. The talent is there. We just need to tap into it. Thank you. Thank you for that response. So we'll just take one last question and then we'll close the question answer session. So there's one question from Christopher asking, Aspen mentioned having set aside 2 billion rand to partnerships in manufacturing. Is this accessible by firms outside South Africa? I believe, Ms. Lorraine, you can go ahead and answer that question.
Yeah, look, I think that's 2 billion rand of Aspen's own funding for its capex. So the available funding from the various funding organizations needs to be accessed independently.
Okay, great. So I can see we do have other questions. So feel free to reach out to either myself or any of the panelists on social media, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer the questions that you have. Due to time, I will close down the question and answer session, and we'll just move to quick parting shots, just a quick parting shot from each of the speakers. We can start off with Mr. Patrick. Your parting shot for today's presentation.
Yeah, I'm going to sound very boring because it's the same thing about market. I think governments and multinational organizations like Gavi and UNICEF equally have to come to the party, have to come to the table, provide incentivized mechanisms for investment in African vaccine manufacturing ASAP. Without that, it's going to fall flat on its face. So the market access remains a key thing. Governments need to come beyond just statements, but there needs to be action. The second thing, if I might just add to this, is that we recognize that WHO pre-qualification is the gateway to accessing the Gavi markets. And we also need to then examine and investigate how WHO pre-qualification can be achieved in an expedited way for African vaccine manufacturers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick. Ms. Lorraine, your parting shot.
Yeah, no, I think it's been a very interesting debate, and to me, there's a few points that we need to consider. We need to have a coordinated and collaborative approach to this issue. If it's not, you could end up with disparate investment. As I said earlier, too much of one thing and not enough of another. There are a large number of aspects to consider. I think Patrick's raised the skills and the training and keeping the skills and long-term, need for having interns and others that can work on the sites. And I think the marketplace has to support this initiative. If we have a lot of time and effort and money spent on this, and procurers in the marketplace don't support it, then just pure economics, it's not going to survive. And we'll be in the same position later. So I think those are the key takeaways for mine.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ms. Lorraine. Dr. Michael, your parting shot.
Thank you, Hinjal. I think for me, it's about collaboration. It's about sharing information. It's about coming to conversations like this that we're having today, just to level set and see where individuals, parties can contribute in a synergistic way so that we create a win-win scenario for Africa. We don't all have to make the same vaccine. If we come together and share information, then we can shape the market so that we as manufacturers can benefit from that market. The market is there, the market is huge. There's an opportunity for us to have a significant impact when it comes to public health. When you look at the product portfolio, it's not just COVID, it's the childhood immunization programs that we need to support. It's adolescent girls who need HPV vaccines. It's other unique vaccines that we use for therapy, not just for preventing infectious diseases. So there is a lot of opportunity there for all of us, but we need to get together, we need to collaborate, we need to talk to each other so that we can get to the next level sooner in a more cost-effective way. Thank you.
Great. I like that. Thank you, Dr. Michael. Over to you, Krupali, your parting shot.
Thanks, Angel. I'm just going to say that for the Africa we want, we all need to work together to achieve it. Local manufacturing is one aspect for it, but You need policy advancement, you need harmonization in regulatory, you need the marketplaces everyone has so rightfully put it today. So without collaboration, local manufacturing is nothing and will not be able to achieve anything. But for the Africa that we want, if we're all able to work together to achieve it, it's definitely a possibility and definitely something that we can achieve.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your parting shots. So I think it's been an explosive discussion. I believe I have learned quite a bit, and I'm sure our participants have learned quite a bit as well. So from the flavor of the month, from what Mr. Patrick said, to having a big party, I think that is what is needed. And as what Dr. Michael mentioned, that we're just focusing on COVID vaccine, but there are other vaccines out there that we do need to speak about, that we need to have conversations about, that, we in Africa can do this. So yeah, the sun may yet shine on the manufacturing sector in Africa, but we do have the galvanizing vision, as we have seen here, and we do have the mobilizing strategies, as we've seen with what Aspen is doing, with all the unprecedented engagement from the major stakeholders in Africa, including us, and of course the government and funding institutions. So the need for manufacturing of these health products and technologies has been justified. The goals have been set. The action has been taken. What is remaining now for the continent is to be, to become more self-reliant, is become bolder, and more, action needs to be taken. And from what I've gathered from all of this, some of the few action points that I have gathered is we need a development of a long-term, focused, well-coordinated, Africa-initiated, Africa-led, research and development advocacy targeting the highest in the ministerial level, to the corporate bodies, to the philanthropies, to all the major stakeholders. Second point that I have gathered is an institution of deliberate strategies to address the limited vaccine pipeline, such as diversifying the players on the field through establishment of several vaccine-related freedom, like how Dr. Michael mentioned, we need to share the information. We all don't need to come out and make the same vaccine. We can make different vaccines. There are thousands of vaccines out there. We all don't need to go out and produce the same one. The third one is, which all of us have spoken about, is building genuine local, collaborations, sharing the information, ownerships of the vaccine projects, effective communications. Policies are needed to compel and externally fund these vaccine-related projects to demonstrate adequate local involvement. And I want to finish off with what Dr. Michael had saying, that we must transform the destiny of vaccine production in Africa, beyond the current model that we have, and to take it to the end-to-end manufacturing and include research and development from, to include it a shorter distance from bench to clinic. And just to round off, in the end, it's only Africans that can change the narrative for Africa. We're the only ones who can change the destiny in the continent. Quality vaccines are being produced. That effort needs to expand and expound now. We have no choice but to do it ourselves. So thank you so much for all your time and your dedication towards this. I hope you all are leaving with enriched knowledge like how I have. But before we close, I want to just highlight the poll results before we all depart. Yes, as you can see on the screen, one of the first questions we had was, which of the following 8 programs for partnerships for African vaccine manufacturing framework has the most potential to expand Africa's production of vaccine therapeutics and diagnostics? You can all see the answers on your screen of what everybody thinks. And then our second question was, which of the below is not a pillar of the new public health order for Africa? As we all know, the one that's not a public health order is healthcare financing. Moving on to the third question. As per your knowledge, when do you think AVMI was launched? As we know, the correct answer is 2010. 2010. I think that was the last question. Yes, yeah. So just to highlight, this series was the third in a series of 4 we have this year. We will be closing off the year with the next series about boosting Africa's infectious disease surveillance and response capabilities. Please feel free to spread the word or join us into these sessions as we hold the last one for the year. Moving on, we also have an event in November called The Role of the Private Sector in Advancing Men's Health in Africa, which will be a hybrid event, and it will be in Nairobi, and you can also join in online. We have 4 interesting sessions around cancer, around men's reproductive health, around infectious diseases. So, feel free to reach out if you want any more information on that. And then last but not the least, yes, as we all know, the importance of blood for Africa's mothers, how important blood is in maternal health. This is an event by COBA. COBA is one of the organizations that we work closely with, and they'll be having a site session on Tuesday. So, if you need any more information, please feel free to reach out to them or reach out to us, and we'll be happy to provide information on the same. Yeah, I think that is the end of the session. Thank you so much. I think it was great. And yeah, happy to connect again in the future. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you.